Yep, we're all set for YouTube. So
Good.
I'll watch it, and then if anyone likes to chat there, I can always share it to the main chat in WebEx. Okay,
Sounds good.
great.
Is the setting right, Joe? Is it what we had talked about?
I
The
think so. Yep.
presentation? Okay.
Cruz, where are you?
I am in Providence. So are we being? Is this being recorded already?
Yeah, we started it.
Okay,
Ooh,
so
never mind.
What's
Your address is- What's your social security number? Never mind.
So we have people coming in now. So we'll give it a couple more minutes.
All right, well, we can get started. Hello out there in WebEx world, and thank you for joining us this afternoon in the final presentation of this year's Without Limits series entitled COVID-19 and Communities of Color. Today's panel features faculty conducting vital research on the disparate impacts of the current pandemic among marginalized and minoritized communities, with critical implications for policies and practices on the ground. Allow me to briefly introduce each of our speakers. Dr. Benjamin Yong is an associate professor of anthropology here at SUNY New Paltz. His research focuses on class mobility, political attitudes, gender, sexuality, health, and religion, with regional focus on Brazil and other settings in Latin America. His recent publications include Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil, and Cynical Citizenship, Gender, Regionalism, and Political Subjectivity in Porto Alegre, Brazil. He recently co-directed a 3-year investigation funded by the National Science Foundation of political subjectivities among the demographic sector once known as Brazil's new middle class, focusing on perceptions of the 2013 to 2018 crisis, cultural memory of authoritarian pasts, and the rise of popular conservatism. Dr. Cari Cruz Bueno is a postdoctoral research associate at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. Her research is in applied microeconomics with a focus on labor, education, and health. Her research addresses topics such as school choice, teacher labor markets, and student non-cognitive skills. She has received funding from National Science Foundation, American Society of Hispanic Economists, the National Economics Association, and the Southern Economics Association. Prior to receiving her PhD from Georgia State, she was a Teach for America Corps member and taught 7th grade special education in mathematics in Hawaii. And Dr. Cruz Caridad Bueno is an economist specializing in economic development, gender violence, and the political economy of race, gender, and class inequality. Pardon me. She is the recipient of the 2014 Rhonda Williams Prize from the International Association for Feminist Economics for her qualitative research on low-income Black women workers, work funded by the Inter-American Foundation's Grassroots Development Fellowship in the Dominican Republic, and her quantitative research on the economic, political, and social correlates of gender violence. She is currently an assistant professor of Black Studies here at SUNY New Paltz, and her work has been featured in the Review of Black Political Economy, Feminist Economics, Violence Against Women, and the American Economic Association's Minority Report. Each of our speakers is invited to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time after to hear your questions and have some interactive discussion using the chat afterward. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jung.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Just one moment. I look okay? Great. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here at this, as we're all entering the home stretch of a busy semester. A couple of quick acknowledgements. Thanks very much to the Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean's Office for the invitation, and especially to Despina Williams-Parker for doing all the legwork on this amazing series. Also, thanks to the Black Lives Matter collective on our campus, who have been a really, for over a year, the members of which have been great interlocutors as the project that I'll be presenting some of our research from has evolved and been implemented, and we're now analyzing the data. The research that I'll be presenting today is a collaborative affair. It was conceived of, implemented, and analyzed in 2 classes that I taught last semester, and I want to just give credit where credit's due. So these were a research methods in anthropology class and an upper level class called gender and anthropology. And the members of these, the students in these 2 classes, as their final research project, had to engage some chunk of our massive data set that I'll be telling you about and write a final research paper about it. And I learned a lot from them. And they did a lot of the work on this project. I also want to thank Professor Mike Gale, the interim chair of Black Studies, who gave me a lot of statistical and technical advice when we were developing the survey. And also, before I jump in to it, I want to mention that this is the 10th presentation this semester that I have given of this research, and it's actually been great. It's an unusual thing for me to do, but it's been really good to circulate. A lot of colleagues have invited me and a couple of student clubs, and it's been really fascinating to talk about the theme of vaccine hesitancy on our own campus this semester. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about our study, and I'm going to present some key findings from that study. First, I want to just signal a little bit of let's say, shameless plug for anthropology, just to let you all know that there is a long tradition going back several decades of anthropologists who look at the question of vaccine preparedness, which is to say, as a vaccine is becoming available, or even if it isn't yet available, how are people going to react to it? What are their concerns going to be? Etc. And I've just put on the slide here some major examples, and if you're interested in this stuff, you can look it up. But certainly there's research on already existing vaccines like MMR that all of the students on our campus have to have, influenza vaccine, hepatitis, and also vaccines that are still being tested and worked out, such as HIV/AIDS and all of the others on the list. One of the things that's distinctive about how anthropologists like myself study vaccines is that we're interested in how vaccines are understood and perceived by real people going about their everyday lives in the actual, quotidian contexts of everyday life. I should also say that even though I'm, plugging anthropology, social scientists, scholars broadly have done amazing work, and from the humanities, on how vaccines are being perceived in the United States, and how these perceptions are influenced by legacies from history and emergent cultural forces, especially vis-a-vis online social media. If any of you are really interested, I put on my slide an amazing project called the Vaccine Confidence Project, which is run by the amazing anthropologist Heidi Larson, although it's not only anthropologists, but it's a great place to have a look if you want to learn more about vaccine confidence. All right, so how do anthropologists study vaccine attitudes? Well, in a lot of ways, but generally it breaks down into 4 lines, if you will. So first of all, we're interested in how do people understand actually what vaccines are, the substance of vaccines, what the vaccine itself. Do they consider a new vaccine or a potential vaccine safe? Do they think it's important? Do they think that they need to get vaccinated? And do they think it works, the question of efficacy? We're also interested in how do people perceive implementation policies. For example, will a new vaccine, let's say a COVID-19 vaccine, be perceived to be affordable, easy to access, easy to get to as far as public transportation, and provided in a place that feels safe? Increasingly, in this age of online social media, we're very interested in where people get information about vaccines as they appear. Certainly that could include family and friends, health workers, public authorities, professors, religious figures, or people they don't know through online social media. Finally, a lot of anthropological research on vaccines focuses on ethical considerations for who should have access to a new vaccine first. And needless to say, this is something we've all been living through in the last several months. And in the state of New York, any adult at this point is able to get an appointment for a vaccine. But I think we can all think about how, over the last few months, it's been interesting and sometimes contentious about who had access first. All right. I'm just going to mention very briefly, I'm not going to talk about this much, but if you're not familiar with these concepts, they're worth knowing. So vaccine uptake, this is a public health concept. It's basically about the taking up of new medical technologies, which could be a new drug or a new vaccine. And it's what in the field of public health, which is my background, that we're usually trying to, increase the uptake of promising, safe, new health technologies. But of course, there are obstacles to uptake, and we want to know about those obstacles as well. Some concepts I'm sure just about everyone's heard in the last year is confidence in vaccines. Are people are they confident that it will work, that it's safe? Enthusiasm for vaccines, and of course, hesitancy. Do people have concerns around getting a new vaccine? And an important clarification, just maybe stating the obvious, is that being vaccine hesitant does not make you an anti-vaxxer. So the anti-vaccination movement, which is frankly could be defined in different ways, but generally these are people who are vaccine critics. They are a subset of people who are vehemently opposed to vaccines, and it's hard to put a statistic on this, but our best guess is that these so-called anti-vaxxers, which is a kind of a pejorative term, is less than 5% of the population. My point here, and I'm not going to be talking about the anti-vaxxers much today, although I'm very interested in that, is that being hesitant about vaccines doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer. I've actually found this semester that I've had to explain that point in the presentations I've been giving, so I thought I would mention it here. All right. So what we knew before COVID was that in the United States, the US population was generally pretty good with, pretty accepting and interested and enthusiastic for new vaccines, not just COVID, but generally. From a public health standpoint, we're looking for a relatively high number so we can achieve herd immunity. What we had concerns about is that as COVID set in last year, we started to discover from a range of national opinion polls, surveys, that the acceptance rate seemed to be going down as potentially as low as less than half of the US population in some of these polls said that they would get a COVID vaccine if it were available today. The big chart on the right, there's no need to kind of talk through each of the numbers, but what I'll call to your attention is that in some of these, basically this is one poll from about a year ago, so it's well before the rollout of vaccines. You can see that there are differences. The blue lines on the right side are bigger for some subcategories. So for example, you can see very clearly that at least at that point, that people with more formal educational attainment, postgraduate, college grads, had more enthusiasm for a potential hypothetical COVID vaccine than people with less educational attainment, formal higher education. There's a political dimension to this too, and I'm not going to talk about all of these right now. I am going to come back to the question of race and ethnicity, because the pattern that you see on that little info graphic on the right, namely that there's something going on with race and ethnicity and vaccine hesitancy, plays out in the data that I'll show you shortly. As of today, literally today, April 28th, 96.7 million people are fully vaccinated in the United States. That's a little bit less than half. And we have seen that the vaccination rate among whites is greater than the vaccination rate among Hispanic or Latinx and Blacks in most, but not quite all, US states. Also interesting to observe that the vaccination rate is higher among Asian citizens in the United States than whites. I'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. Vaccine hesitancy the most common examples are lack of trust. People express some lack of trust in the pharmaceutical companies, saying it was a rush job that the vaccine was developed. They don't feel comfortable with that, or they don't trust the government, the regulatory agencies of the government. They may feel like vaccines weren't properly tested, or they may have concerns with side effects. Many of us, I think, who are participating in this panel and are listening to it, watching it, maybe identify with some of these. Again, these are just hesitancy. It doesn't make you an anti-vaxxer. All right, so last fall we conducted an online survey, an anonymous online survey. It was approved by the Human Research Ethics Board, which for those of you who have been through that, it shows you how serious my students were that they were willing to put up with that, but we did it. And we piloted this survey in my research methods class. The only way we promoted it was through the student research listserv. And through that, we got, in the end, 341 students. We asked them about a lot of things. I'm not going to be presenting all of the data today, but just so you have a taste, we got a lot of demographic characteristics. We asked them about their history with vaccination, their health status, their mental health status, a whole bunch of questions about their vaccine attitudes generally, and specifically about a hypothetical COVID vaccine. Remember, we did this research before the vaccine rolled out, right before. We asked them where they get their information and some ethical considerations. We also did some follow-up qualitative interviews with a subsample, but I'm not going to talk about that today. As far as our sample of these 341 students, you can see the spread here, a good spread concentrated among third-year students, but a nice mix overall. Interestingly, cisgendered women are disproportionately represented in our sample, and I won't speculate on that, although it's interesting to mention that certainly that cisgendered women who became aware of our survey were more interested ultimately in participating than the other groups. As far as race ethnicity, our sample is definitely disproportionately white. But we have in our sample of 341, we have 55 people, or just over 16%, who did not identify as white. As far as identifying as Latinx, Latina, or Latino, we have 13.9% of our sample, which is underrepresentation. 22% of our student body is Latino, Latina, Latinx, so underrepresented. And you can see the spread when we ask people to pick a social class category that they most identified with. A fairly normal distribution. Interesting to me that we have a fifth of our students identify as upper middle class, but that's perhaps a conversation for another day. This is asking our students, our sample respondents, about their political sensibilities. And by my mind, this came as no surprise and fits the stereotype of New Paltz as a sort of a hippie, leftist, progressive enclave. But of course, that's not the whole story, and you can see that here on this slide as well. All right, so what I'm going to do now in the remainder of my presentation is I'm going to present you some findings, some key findings. The question that I'm addressing today, the research question, is: do enthusiasm and hesitancy around a hypothetical COVID-19 vaccine vary by race, ethnicity, gender, and class? Now, what do we mean by enthusiasm and hesitancy, or how did we operationalize those concepts? So enthusiasm was based on one question from our survey instrument, which you can see it here. We gave our respondents a statement: once a safe and effective vaccine is widely available, I plan to get vaccinated as soon as possible. And we let them agree or disagree on a 5-point scale. And if they chose to agree or strongly agree, we considered that more enthusiastic, and any other response, we considered that less enthusiastic. As far as hesitancy, we had a whole bunch of questions about concerns about side effects, harmful toxic substances in, the ingredients, concerns that they might get COVID symptoms if they took the vaccine. And each of these could add some points. And if they had a lot of points, 3 to 4 points, we considered them more hesitant, and otherwise we considered them less hesitant. Overall, enthusiasm, when we just look at the entire sample, we found that 62% of our sample was more enthusiastic, was basically enthusiastic for the coming of a COVID vaccine, and 37.9% was less enthusiastic. So put another way, about 3/5 of students in our sample were or are enthusiastic for a hypothetical COVID-19 vaccine. Hesitancy, we found that about 1/3 of our sample expressed hesitancy, more hesitancy around a hypothetical vaccine. When we look at this, when we break it down by gender, I won't show you the numbers, but I will tell you that there were no significant differences. So for those of you who are statistics people, I'm doing very basic chi-square crosstabs with looking at p-values, no regressions here, for those of you who are interested in such things. So, and I'm happy if anyone wants to talk about methodology at a more nitpicky level, I'm happy to. The important point here is that there were no statistically significant differences in enthusiasm or hesitancy by gender. That's the first point. We did find, as far as class identification, that there was no differences in terms of enthusiasm, but hesitancy, we found that there was more hesitancy reported among people who identify as working class than any of the other categories. That's something we could either talk about or not talk about, but I wanted to share it because it was a highly significant finding that came out of this. We're not arguing causality here. We're not arguing that being working class makes you hesitant, just that there's an overall association between these two things that came out in the data. Now, getting to the crux of the matter and the final substantive part of my comments today, race and ethnicity. So first of all, are there any differences in enthusiasm and hesitancy depending on whether the respondent identifies as Latina, Latino, or Latinx? And we found that enthusiasm, no differences. Basically same levels of enthusiasm, regardless of whether the respondent identifies as Latinx. Hesitancy, however, is another story. We found that hesitancy is higher among students who identify as Latinx. And I'm not going to take you through all of these numbers, but you can see that it's pretty noticeable that there's more hesitancy reported among 47.8%. And we can talk about that later on. The important point is that there's some connection between Latinx status, identity, and hesitancy, and vaccine hesitancy. I'm getting to my last couple of slides. The end is in sight. Enthusiasm, I'm still talking about race and ethnicity, racial identification category. Hold on a minute. Let me just make sure I'm not skipping over anything important. Okay. So what we can see here, sorry everyone, just getting myself organized. All right, so what we see here, as far as enthusiasm goes, we see that enthusiasm is lower among students who identified as African American or Black, significantly lower. If you want to compare, we could say that there's less enthusiasm among 66.7% of African American or Black identified respondents. And if you look at the corresponding figures for Asians, 33.3%, whites, 35.3%, or anyone else, 50%, there's something going on there, and it's something for us to talk about. When we just played with a variable and just presented it a different way and just said, does enthusiasm for vaccine vary by white versus non-white? It comes out very clearly. There's much more much less enthusiasm, lower enthusiasm by respondents who did not identify as white. Hesitancy, now we're getting just to the end here. What we find here is that hesitancy is lower, noticeably and statistically significantly lower among white identified respondents in our sample. There is, I know this is kind of convoluted, but see if you can follow this. More hesitancy was reported up by 28% of white identified respondents, but was reported by 60% of African American, Black respondents, and 50% of Asian identifying students. So again, there's something going on there. This isn't an argument about causality, just association. Finally, so where does this leave this in summary? Somewhat interestingly, no major differences as far as gender or gender identity. No major differences among social class identity as far as enthusiasm, but something going on as far as hesitancy that seems to be more prevalent among students who identified as working class. And finally, relating directly to the panel themes, that there is more hesitancy among Latinx students, or based on our sample, less enthusiasm and more hesitancy among African American and non-white students. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'll be really interested to hear, obviously, what other panelists have to say, but really what those of you who are joining us and attending the session have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for that very insightful presentation. We'll certainly have time for Q&A about that insightful data shortly. Let's turn it over to Dr. Cari Cruz Bueno and Dr. Cruz Caridad Bueno for their presentation.
Great. So good afternoon, everybody. That was a great presentation. Thank you, Dr. Young. And I think, interestingly, we also did this work before the vaccine came out. And so we'll be able to talk in the Q&A about where we're at now as well. And so the title of our short presentation, Corona, the Great Exposure, How the Pandemic Has Exacerbated Inequalities in American Society. As Dr. Hunt said, I'm co-presenting today with my dearest colleague and my sister, who is also a PhD economist. And so this is really special for us.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for having us.
The premise of our paper that we wrote is that, you know, we're seeing in media, in discussions, that people were talking about Corona being the great equalizer, that everybody was having a hard time, that everybody was suffering. And in fact, what we said was, you know, we looked at it, we said, no, what this is doing is actually exposing these pre-existing inequalities that are foundational to US society. And so we really, we're gonna just touch on race, health, economic outcomes, education, and some aspects of gender inequality. But really, the first group that experienced heightened levels of violence when the pandemic started was the Asian American community. You had politicians, political elites using racist terms to describe coronavirus. And so what you saw was that the reporting of hate crimes amongst Asian Americans skyrocketed from March 2020 to August 2020. 2,500 reported cases by Asian Americans of hate crimes, of course, and we know that so much more goes unreported. So what we saw was that Asian Americans not only had to protect themselves from the coronavirus, but it was also the physical violence that they were experiencing, which we have seen continues to now. Essence magazine was actually the first outlet to report racial disparities. again, like highlighting the importance of independent Black media. So in April of 2020, Essence reported that although the state of Michigan's Black population was only 14%, 40% of deaths related to coronavirus were Black people, right? After Essence reported, then the New York Times started picking up the story about racial disparities related to COVID deaths. When thinking about Native American communities that have been really hard hit, looking at the data, we see that Native American communities are 19% times less likely to have running water. One of the most important things that you need to stay healthy, and to protect yourself from coronavirus. Native Americans are 3.3 times more likely to die from coronavirus than white Americans. And so and then of course, we saw all of the police brutality and the public murderings, lynchings of Black people. So one of the things that coronavirus really exposed, right, was the history of white supremacy in the United States and a history of white racial violence against communities of color. And that was something that, again, right, that coronavirus exposed and really brought to the forefront. And I will turn it over to Dr. Bueno.
Thank you. So our second point that we look at in this article is looking at health inequality. So that's the first thing that people think about with coronavirus, given that it's a health concern foremost. People are dying, people are sick. And so what we find is that Black and Latinos are less likely to be insured with health insurance when compared to whites. This is a big issue because the US health market is one of the most expensive in the world. And without health insurance, you will either not get any service or have an astronomical bill that you cannot pay for. And so what Rooms and her co-authors find is that almost 18% of unemployed Latinos were uninsured, which is crazy to think about because when you're unemployed, you get almost quote unquote, or policy should be working for you to get easy access to federal funded, reduced price health insurance. And still we find the stigma and the fear that Latinos have historically from the amount of persecution they've gotten from law enforcement, such as ICE, and how coming to, even when they're legal, even when they do have the rights to these unemployment rates, they still won't come forward and get insured due to the historical persecution of Latinos in the United States. They also find that even those who are employed, when we come to looking at the third from the second group, employed essential non-health care, so we're thinking about grocery stores, anyone who's an essential worker in the food market, restaurants, they are 4 times more likely to not be insured than whites. And so it's not something about just employment or not being employed, it's also about this bigger picture of less access to something that we'll propose at the end should be universal to all people in the United States. And they also find in this report is that Blacks and Latinos, especially essential workers, had higher anxiety and depression rates than white essential workers. And so as true economists, and I'm biased to think that this is such an important part of everyday life, but it is. People in this capitalist society need money, make money, and work, essentially. And so when we think about the economic perspective of this pandemic, the inequality have existed for countless years, since the beginning, centuries, since the beginning of the founding of the United States. And so what we see is that for decades, Blacks and Latinos have had higher unemployment rates than whites, especially when we see it broken down by race. And in this table, I really liked it because it showed the Great Recession on the left panel compared to the pandemic recession. And so hopefully for those students who are extremely young and didn't experience 2007 to 2009, that was a big recession that happened, mostly done by Wall Street. And so what we see there was that at its worst, over the whole US population, it got to 10.6. But what we saw in the pandemic in April 2020, it got as high as 14.4. This is 4 percentage points higher than we have historically seen. This is, in any economist's minds, like huge red flags.
Yes.
This is
A big
this
problem.
is doom. This is beyond scary. And so, but what's even more interesting is that this was even worse for women, even worse for people of color in general. And specifically, I wanted to highlight in the worst of the pandemic, Latina women were the highest unemployed at 18.7%. And then this was corrected to 20%. So if you look at the Hispanic woman, you'll see 20.5. So the BLS always goes around and corrects for underreporting. And then the second highest group was Black women at 16.2% unemployment rate. Interestingly, Asian women also, when we think about, we think about absolute numbers, but Asian women have the largest absolute increase in unemployment.
Mhm.
And so what we're thinking is this group that's historically very strong in the labor market, now they have the biggest drop. And that's directly, we can think about correlation with the jobs that these women had, as well as the racial and hate crimes that they were experiencing going in person. And one thing that we noted in the paper was Native American numbers are not even presented. We don't know how bad unemployment is for the Native American population. And so without numbers, without actual data, we can't even address or understand where to address this issue. So it is beyond sad for me as a applied quantitative microeconomist that we do not have this data to really make changes. And so what a lot of economists are now calling this is a she recession. And they're saying she recession because of how much it's impacted the female labor market. So one aspect is we're seeing the raw numbers. Women are exiting the labor market. Women are being pushed out of the labor market. Women are being unemployed, fired from the labor market. In addition to that, women are also facing the pressures of home and being the leaders and managers of their households and the main caregivers. So many reports now have come out showing how women were more likely to be the sole care providers during the pandemic. And a lot of focus has been sole provider to children, but it also they're the sole provider to their elderly parents or grandparents. And so this greater family extension falling again on the women. And what women had to do, predominantly women, of course, there are some males who stepped in, but predominantly this burden fell on women. And what the biggest thing about education and inequality that existed, as we're continuously saying, racial inequality in the education field existed, but what we saw was students, due to coronavirus and the safety of all the staff, the teachers, the students, everyone had to move to remote or virtual learning. And in previous work, I've found that students who attend these full-time virtual schools, which is these virtual schools before COVID-19, they've had very negative outcomes when it comes to student test scores as well as graduation rates. And there's already plenty of research of my colleagues coming out, really showing already how low income, Black, Latino students with special needs have already had disproportionate learning loss, and really thinking about what we think about in the education policy world is what kind of measures can we really implement to offset all these negative outcomes for those who have been hit the hardest with the pandemic. And in contrast, we see that those that were at the bottom of the inequality, or those worse, in contrast to those in the wealthy, they've created these learning pods. And so wealthy families, families from affluent incomes, communities, they decided, well, we can hire a tutor, we can hire a person, and the 4 or 5 families get together and our students will continue to, our children will continue to learn. While as low income working families did not have those kind of privileges that the money and just privilege of not suffering from coronavirus really allows you to have.
in thinking about the disproportionate impacts on women, one that was evident almost immediately was the way that women suffered physically, gender violence, or what we can also call intimate partner violence, domestic violence, depending which kind of context we're talking about. Several economists have noted the relationship between women's economic status and their reporting of experiencing gender violence in the household. Bueno and Henderson, me and my co-author from Penn State, Macmillan and Gartner, really key work as well. And what we find, for example, is that when women work, right, when women have access to their own funds, when women are wealthier, they are less likely to report experiencing gender violence. They're at a lower probability of experiencing gender violence. And given what we've seen with the data, right, the burdens placed on women, the way that women are exiting the labor market, we can just surmise, right, that they are at a heightened risk of experiencing gender violence. The coronavirus related telework, the unemployment, shelter in place, remote learning for students has coincided with increased levels of intimate partner violence as well. There was a really interesting research paper that just came out, Urton and al. 2020, where they find that at the very beginning of the pandemic, March and April, when these shelter in place mandates came out, whether they were government imposed or self-imposed, police departments received more phone calls for domestic violence situations. When that first round of stimulus payments went out, the number of phone calls dropped. The only places it didn't drop where you had a high density population of Latinx and non-US citizen populations, which we know one piece of it is that even many Latinx people, non-US citizens who qualified, right, for these stimulus payments didn't receive them, right, or receive them much later. And also the way that Dr. Bueno talked about the hesitancy to go to police departments because of the way that we're brutalized, right? When we call for help, we don't always get help, is what we've seen. And so what we see happening in the US is reflected in the larger global stage as well. Thinking about, even women losing access to contraception is a form of gender violence, right? It's a restriction on women's freedom, women's rights. So thinking about it largely as well. And we have, we're at the end, we promise. We have some policy recommendations. As Dr. Bueno said earlier, universal healthcare. Healthcare is a public good with positive externalities, right? It is a disgrace.
Which means we all benefit from people being healthy.
We all benefit from people being healthy. We need federal job guarantee program that provides full employment
And a living wage.
During the economic crisis, right, they've been calling these stimulus payments. These are not stimulus payments. These are debt relief. These are debt relief payments for low income and working class people, right? Stimulus is new spending. What we've seen is that when people get these payments, they pay their rent that they haven't been able to pay. They pay their credit cards off. So again, right, we need consistent payments to working class families, low income families, families that have lost their jobs. We talked about federal funding targeted to children of color and working parents, and Biden just put out his plan for the America Families Plan.
Yeah, where he really focuses on paid parent leave as well as universal pre-K and free 2 years community college. So exciting, and hopefully that passes, because I think that's a first step to the amount of federal funding that we need and resources that we need in these areas.
We talk about also in the paper resources to protect to help vulnerable populations protect themselves from domestic violence and gender violence and IPV. Really going back to Dr. Young's talk, the equitable distribution of vaccines and transparency, and the distribution and transparency about the science and the safety of these actually. And then, you know, part of the argument as well is that in the midst of a pandemic, we saw all of these movements for social justice. And it really was the communities that were hit the hardest by coronavirus that were at the forefront. And what we talk about is the fact that increasing inequality is bad for democracy. Black activists are at the forefront of social justice movements and movements for real democracy. And these are important for all Americans, right? Talking about the problem, right, is inequality. We need reparations to the Black community, right? So these are some of our policy recommendations.
Yeah, we just want to give thanks and acknowledgement to the AEA for selecting our paper for publication, as well as to Spina, her emails and organization, to the moderator and our co-panelists. And we do have this paper is publicly available and free. So any professors on this call, we really suggest that you read the paper and use it in your classroom because
it's a great conversation starter.
Yeah, it's very accessible. All our family members have read it.
Yeah.
So it is.
And they're not economists.
And they're not economists. And so it's really for all levels of college students, and you can really engage it to any of your particular fields and having the discussion go to where you need it to go. With further readings.
So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. We're really looking forward to your questions and dialogue.
Stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation, critical work, contextualizing really kind of these deep connections, you know, not just the health impacts of the pandemic, but relative to social movement and foundational inequalities and so much more. I'm also going to try to toggle over to the chat box here. So anyone out there, I think we've got 26 participants with us this evening. Thank you for joining us. Please feel welcome to post your questions, thoughts, comments in the chat. And I'm happy to help facilitate dialogue between our presenters this evening. I'll just give a moment as folks maybe are gathering some thoughts.
Don't be shy. Yeah.
Please do use the chat. I can't necessarily see if anyone's raising a hand or something as we figure out this techno world.
Well, as people continue to collect their thoughts, I did have a question for Ben about, or a suggestion. I'm really hesitant when you say there is no gender differences, because the population that you're looking at is really just female. It was almost like 80%, right? And so I'd be more interested in just singling out female and maybe doing it by race and just showing those results, because saying that there's no gender when there's like only 10 or 1% or whatever percent of male seems like a hard stretch even for associations.
Quick response point, very well taken. The number is 67% of the sample of 341, but I think your point is still valid. And I tried to set up. I mean, honestly, you know, I'm not arguing that this sample is like nicely representative of the New Paltz student body. It's meant to just sort of to be generative with some, you know, some associations that are clear, but I think your point is well taken. It doesn't prove that there is no association. It just, we didn't have a sample probably sufficient to show it if it's there.
Yeah.
What percent of the population at New Paltz is women though? I think that's a good question too. We can't say that there's no gender difference because of the way that, but I think that there are more women on campus than there are.
I mean, in general, you want to say
That's true.
But not that many more.
Right.
I don't actually know the exact number, but it's,
Mhm.
I agree.
Yeah, but still, there's a question in the chat for us.
There is a question in the chat. Can you, so everyone can see the chat? Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for the response. Yes. Well, take it away, Doctors Bueno.
So, I think what's more interesting to talk about is, because when we talk about debt, we have to talk about wealth inequality.
Yeah, so the question is,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more about debt and how it has played out in communities of color during the pandemic? Yeah, and so I think Cruz is right to start with, a lot of people don't know income and wealth distribution in the US. And so I just did a class on poverty, inequality, and race in the US. And one of the big things is that the Black or non-white population is wealth accumulation is like -600, which means the vast majority is in debt. Not only do they not have any wealth,
We're in debt.
And so I think that's where it starts off, where we're coming from a place of truly being pushed behind.
Well, and to add to, and that's a great question, that in the chat, when we look at, why is wealth important? Wealth is a way that you can pass on inheritance. It's a way, it's a form of security, right?
Oh.
It's when there's a pandemic, right? You have resources to have a learning pod. You have resources so that if one parent becomes unemployed, or one, if it's a two family.
Well, especially like in New York, wealth meant that the wealthy New Yorkers were able to go to their Cape Cod, their houses in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, and just be in their wilderness and
Be
to their
safe.
second house and be safe, whereas low income Latino Blacks had to stay in their overpopulated apartments, sometimes multi-generational households, where the spread, as we know, with such close contact is
Much higher.
worse.
And I think, speaking to that point, again, we have to go back to that question of reparations, right? Until we address the way that racism and white supremacy in the US has provided, privileges and benefit and money to white people that they didn't work for, right? That it stopped our inability to pass on wealth, right? And that we see the reproduction of inequality. It is the way that you see these disparate outcomes. And so this discussion of debt, we started off the pandemic with more debt, as was pointed out by Carrie Cruz, and it has just gotten worse. It's been further exacerbated.
Right. So I'm thinking about like The Economist came out with a general number. It didn't even break it out by race, but just in general in the US, when people receive the stimulus, the majority of the money went to debt payments. So this is just actual numbers. Just most Americans paid out their stimulus to debt they owed, credit card debt, some paid student loans as they were frozen. So all different types of debt. And that's just what's been shown
in the data. Oh, great. There's another question.
From Edith. People of color are not only uninsured, low income, and wealth, they are also overrepresented in essential jobs and thus face a higher risk of COVID. Yes. Yeah, so that's in the paper. We were only allowed 12 minutes.
And we took
yeah, we went over a little bit. So we definitely mentioned that in the paper. If you're really interested, it's also a very accessible paper by Dr. Grooms and her co-authors, where they really do look at all that. And that was part of the point of highlighting essential workers being uninsured, because they're constantly being exposed to COVID-19. This is a group you would want the most access to the health sector and healthcare. And so it is very depressing. It's very disheartening that this group is exposing their life, exposing their family's life, and still the federal government hasn't given back to protect them.
And we see and this is the thing, that we see that the spread is much higher in our communities of color, and it's disproportionate death rates. The same thing too for pregnant women. Black and Latinx pregnant women who contract COVID have much worse outcomes than white women. Recent research has showed. So this is key. This is essential.
Yeah.
I think that's why we really argue for universal health care. In terms of OECD countries, we are the only one without universal health care. And
paid family
leave. And so we can see the fact that we have such a precarious situation, privatized economy, right? Very, very little what's left of a social safety network. It just doesn't impact individuals negatively, it impacts our economy as well, right? And so I think that those are things that we have to think about, are not just important for individuals, it's important for us, for the economy and for economic security. Let's see what else.
I just want to note, I did want to note, reparations came up earlier, and there was a comment. Blair Proctor asked about reparations from an economist's perspective, what those might look like on the ground or in practice. And I just want to be sure that we address that question as well as the others.
Thank you. I didn't see that one.
When economists when we talk about reparations.
So
yeah,
leading economists.
Yeah, the leading economists working on reparations, for those of you who are interested, Dr. William Darity, Jr. of UNC and Duke University, is really at the forefront of this work.
Him and his co-authors. Also very active on Twitter, where he talks a lot about how reparations should work. So if you're really interested, you can join his follow group and you'll get lots of info. But I think the basic is, you want to see?
I don't know.
The basic is that there's been a history of the U.S. accumulated wealth, given the fact that Black people were forced, enslaved, and were forced to do labor without getting paid. And so the reason why white Americans can accumulate wealth is because they had all the riches, all the land. Once, quote unquote, Black Americans are liberated, they still are not given any money, land, and
Jim Crow happens, and we're further excluded. And
further policing, further lynching. And also great work by Dr. Lisa Cook looking at direct association of how lynching actually led to less innovation by Black inventors. And so you think this direct attack, kind of like what we're seeing with the hate crimes with Asian Americans, very similar. This fear actually is not just, oh, they're saying mean things about me. It's actual violent, death, threats that these communities are getting that actually leads to underdevelopment of these communities, and we're just losing out. So that for a nation to grow, we need innovation. And so basically we're missing out in the Black American 13% of innovation that could be happening in the US, but we don't have access to it because we've explicitly undermined and explicitly had policies and encouraged people to further discriminate and hate and attack Blacks and Latinos, Native Americans, as well as Asian Americans. And so reparations is basically like a big paycheck. It needs to be cash. It needs to be actual US dollars that can be used. And it's money. It's
cash payments to people and families, but it's also investments in the main institutions, right?
Stock market.
Right, for Black people. So for example, in the US, for every $2,000 that's spent on a student in a predominantly white school district, $1 is spent for a student in non-black school in non-white school districts, right? So white school district, each kid an average of $2,000. Non-white district, the kid gets $1. When we talk about reparations, we're talking about the federal government needs to put their money where their mouth is and fund schools, right? Non-white school districts. We're talking about healthcare, right? Healthcare, education, developing housing security, developing and providing jobs, right? In Black cities, and in black urban areas, Black suburbs, Black rural areas, right? Because as economists, we can trace, right? We can trace the way that slavery and the legacies of slavery and colonialism created unjust burdens for Black people and unjust enrichment for whites.
Right.
And so that's a really important question. And again, right, these unjust burdens that fall on us, right, create a much more difficult, tenuous situation when there is a virus, when there is a pandemic. So thank you for that question. Oh.
I think there was a question about how do we retroactively work with Native Americans and communities?
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one.
Because we're economists and we're looking at data and we need data to make. So I think one piece of it is thinking about that, again, that white supremacy, that white racial violence, like Native American communities need water, like everybody needs water. It's a universal right, it's a human right. I think that's one of the issues that we see, right? So I think access to running water, these are things that the federal government must address.
Native American women are actually one of the highest groups of gender violence in the United States. Particularly in the Midwest. Very disturbing numbers coming out of those states. And with Native, it's just so hard and it's so disheartening because it's almost like parallel stories with Blacks, where it's like this was their land, it was stripped from them, taken from them, and still there's no recognition that this was theirs, and everything literally is built on disownment by one people to say that now this is ours without any true, and who's making these laws?
Right.
Those who made those laws said that this was very legal, although in the indigenous community and in their laws, it was not legal in any shape or form. And those with force and econ and money and gunpowder.
And I think it's really interesting to point out that when you look at people who are at the forefront of water protectors and movements for social justice around water and access to water is Native Americans in the US. I think one of it, and it's an issue of poverty, Native American poverty rates. So poverty rates, gender violence,
education,
unemployment,
separation of families.
These are all worse in Native American communities. And so I think it really is, again, one of the arguments we make is that unless we really attack white supremacy and racism in the US, this is going to
uplift these communities that have been stripped
of their resources.
Till then, we will not progress.
Right. This will continue to happen, and it weakens security in the United States. So I think that's a really great question, which would alleviate. Many arguments are made against social democratic policies as well as reparations, which will alleviate the kinds of, in particular, critics who say these policies are unaffordable. No, the U.S. can afford them. Right. That's not a question. But let's go back. Drive up national debt. Okay. Or increasing taxes that will lead to a form of legal tax evasion amongst the wealthy.
They already do that.
They already do that, yeah. But let's keep going. What are the arguments we can deploy to such criticism and demonstrate the feasibility of these quite necessary policy interventions? This is a great question. I think one of the most salient ways to do this is we can even look at inequality has been worsening in the US for all Americans. I think that thinking about even like, you know, this will drive taxes up for the wealthy. You know, I guess one thing, because, you know, sometimes these, right, non-race neutral policies, I guess I could call them, right, are dead off the bat because of racism and white supremacy in America. But I think one of the things that we should do is show to Americans that we're all worse off, right? Levels of inequality are currently at the point now where they were right before the Great Depression, right? We have a case where, again, right, it's not the great equalizer. Americans who are at the top of the income distribution have been doing better during this pandemic.
They've increased their wealth by folds.
By folds. So, you know, I think one of the things that we see in this country is that there's not an honest discussion, right? Yeah, like Edith points out, gender and racial inequality are very costly. But the other piece I think is that that's not the argument. This is not the rhetoric that politicians are telling us. I think that there's a very like.
I think another thing is what are we measuring? And an economic talk is what do we want to maximize? What do we want? What is our real normal person? What is your priority?
That's what.
And so if our priority in the capitalist society is some people making more money, then yes, those arguments are true. But there are other countries in the more higher income countries like Sweden that have these taxes and people still live there, and people are actually happier to live in these places because when they're sick, they have 10 days where they can actually recover. Unlike many Americans in the US, they have no sick leave. And so it comes at a cost, but what are we truly valuing? If we're valuing people's lives, if we're valuing people's well-being, if we're valuing
democracy,
mental, if we're valuing democracy, then these are saving us money. These things are saving us money. And one of the researchers I was looking at with Dr. Biden, not Dr. Biden, that's his wife. She probably was telling him what to do as a good wife. President Biden, one of his things is really looking at giving family leave. And so these kind of same arguments come up, oh, this is going to be expensive, we can't do this. But you really have to think about what are the benefits that are going to come from this. When countries have had paid family leave, women are more likely to re-enter the job market because the costs are lower to women. They can now afford to take the time they need, that their bodies physically need to recover, and they can find affordable quality care. So they don't feel like they need to make the decision if that's not what they want. A lot of women, a lot of men want to stay at home, and that's great. And I think everyone should have the option, but there are a lot of people who do desire to enter the workforce, but it's not affordable for them. By the time they pay for quality health care, child care, it's now they're going into debt to have someone else take care of their kid. Sometimes they don't know if it's quality or not, and they still have to work the 9 to 5.
And I think to go back to Carrie's point, and then we'll end.
And one mental thing is that also children who have parents who have these benefits do better at graduating, other life things. So it's not only these parents, it's also their children, and these are the children who are going to innovate and continue to grow the country. So it's an investment that we're making. It's not a debt. It's an investment that we're making in people to further increase and improve the
that is owed to them. That is owed. And I think even, for example, I think, these questions of reparations, social democratic policies, with the monies that we've spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, everybody in the United States that qualified for a 2 or 4 year education could have gone for free. So I think that's my example to show it is really about our values and what is it that we want to fund. And I think, the anti-Asian hate bill passed, and I was really happy. The Emmett Till anti-lynching bill has not passed in the United States. That is disgusting. And so at the foundation of anti-reparation movements, again, is anti-racism, is anti-Blackness and racism in the U.S., which is ingrained in our education system. And really, we need to address these. And I think we need politicians that are honest about it. And so, but thanks for the question. And there's a question here for Ben. Sorry, Ben.
No problem. I'm learning so much. This is really, really great. Okay, so it looks like there are two questions and actually a kind of a comment from Cesar that I also want to respond to. So Cesar, your comment about Native Americans just made me remember something. It's a little off topic and I'm not going to talk about it. I just want to say it, which is the theme of vaccine nationalism, which is to say the presumption that obviously we here in the United States should vaccinate ourselves before we worry about the rest of the world. And that's happening. And we had a couple of questions on the survey about that. How much do our students kind of care about that? Is that something that they reflect on? And the answer is no. And I just want to remind us all, because a lot of us do, post-colonial studies and, we get into power and inequality and histories of colonialism, all that kind of stuff in our thinking and writing. And we are participating in a very much in a global imperialist dynamic in tuning out the needs of the rest of the world. So I just wanted to put that out there since we've also, so anyway, we can talk about that or not, just wanted to say it.
I agree, especially in the case of India right now, which is going through a lot of COVID-19 deaths.
Yep. And then the next one, Kenji, you asked an amazing question, which kind of links, I think, the two presentations today. Kenji asked a question about like, what are we going to do on the campus of New Paltz? Are we going to require that students can't come to classes unless they can document that they're fully vaccinated? A very important question, and I have to assume that the administration has already started to think about that. And I guess I wanted to first say, we already do that for measles, mumps, and rubella, so it wouldn't be the first time. And there is a way you can get out of having to have the MMR, documentation, but you have to go through that exception. So there is a precedent. On the other hand, I think, your presentation, Cari Cruz and Cruz, reminds us that it's not just kind of, well, some people are going to be vaccinated and some people are not. That actually falls down along clear and predictable lines for reasons that, have to do with the legacies of history and have to do with economic structures of inequality and all that. So we can already imagine what the demographic profile of people who haven't, for whatever reason, been vaccinated by the end of August is going to be. We know that. So what are we going to do about that? Well, one thing we can do about it is honestly what the administration could do about it, because I have to assume that they're starting to thinking about it and of course waiting on the Cuomo administration, which ultimately makes this call, is to conduct focus groups with students, particularly students of color, and ask them. It's an open question, and it's a question that could be asked. I also think it's important that we should offer vaccination for anyone who still needs it on our campus. And have some sort of procedure. It's not that hard of a thing to do, and that it does require support from the state government. So the Cuomo administration would have to get behind that, but that's another thing. Right, okay, so then there was the other, so those are some quick thoughts on Kenji's question. Jordana, you asked about the sources of hesitance. Did we ask about that on our survey? Well, yes and no. It's just a one-time cross-sectional survey, so there's only so much you can get on it. We didn't have a question like, if you are hesitant, how did it come to pass? Instead, we asked other questions about where do you get your information, and who are the opinion leaders who are important for you, and what are your political ideologies and all of that. And so we're inferring possible sources based on statistical associations. So we did find, I didn't present this data, but we found a very strong association, not to stigmatize anyone, but between reporting a right-wing political ideology and position and low enthusiasm and high hesitancy for vaccines. So that doesn't prove anything other than that there's a strong association, which I imagine has some connection. And we also, and this I think more directly relates to Jordana's question, we did find that people who rely more on online social media for information about medical issues were more likely to have hesitancy, controlling for all the other variables. So that's about all I got on that, other than speculation from our survey data.
Wonderful discussion and great comments. It sounds like some folks are sending comments directly to the panelists, which is great. It just confuses the moderator, so forgive that. But what a wonderful discussion and such insightful presentations. Since both projects were initiated and completed in the early sort of phases of the pandemic, pre-vaccine rollout, obviously, I wonder if now might be a good time for each presenter to just sort of return, where are you now? What are your next steps? Ben sort of started getting at this just now, but, where do we go from here, given how much has changed and yet how little has changed at the same time, given all the themes that have come up from your work?
I can go first, or doesn't matter, shall I?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go quickly. All right, so there's so much that one could say, but I'll just kind of focus on one quick theme, which is, as a cultural anthropologist, I'm really thinking a lot about forms of cultural stigma that are taking shape now. And, I think, it's the end of April. You could, no one would question you if you said, oh, well, I haven't gotten vaccinated yet. Like lots of people haven't gotten vaccinated yet. But I think that a tipping point is about to happen where we start to say like, oh, I'm having a dinner party or whatever. And like, we can all take off our masks, right? And then it's like, oh, Katie, wait, you haven't been vaccinated yet? What's that all about? And it disturbs me because, again, we know the demographic and some of the structural dimensions for who is more likely to not have been vaccinated. And that opens up all kinds of troubling possibilities. And I'm actually worried a bit about our students who are about to go on, vacation, quote unquote, be off on summer, because that's going to be the months where in our country, those stigma formations start to happen. And I don't know, to make a strange analogy, I have pity on smokers. It's not a great moment to be a smoker. You're going to be stigmatized. And I think that people who haven't gotten vaccinated by the end of the summer, for whatever reason, are going to be treated like bad citizens. And that disturbs me. So that's something I think, putting this all kind of in the present moment, that we should really be thinking about, us, especially as faculty members, over the summer, and what that's going to look like, and how we can dialogue and respond to it.
I agree, Ben. That is a big concern that faculty members, administration are going to have to deal, and I think for our own safety too. So I'm starting at Wesleyan University in the fall, and I think they're trying to get as many people vaccinated, like requiring students to be vaccinated and have in-person classes. But it's still a little scary, like 30 students, but we're still in a small classroom. And so I think professors are going to be worried. Staff at school is going to be worried. So it's going to be a big issue, and it's going to be lots of dialogue, especially when it enters race along those lines too.
Yeah, and I think it's really, you make this really great point, right? It's not that we're not anti-vaccine, we're not anti-vaxxers. It's more like we just don't want to take it first, because of the history
of
that-
testing on Blacks.
Yeah, but I think actually what they like, you know, the Navajo Nation has pretty high vaccination rates at this point. I think 50% of the Navajo Nation has been vaccinated. I think at first, you know, with vaccinations, what you saw was the way that white Americans, wealthy white Americans, were going into like Washington Heights, right, to get their vaccines in this predominantly Dominican neighborhood in New York City. But I think that there's been a shift. I mean, we're really lucky.
Well, I would also comment that the federal government, the Department of Health in the U.S. and the state departments in each state just need to do a continuous better job of informing
And coming into
these
the
communities and really helping them not be hesitant. There's a reason that they're hesitant. And I think social media is a big part. I saw The Social Dilemma on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, it's terrifying but informative.
Right.
And so it's just, these are real things. And there's a generation of people now that their whole life has been social media, which I'm thankful that I'm not in that generation. So I at least can unplug a little bit sometimes. And so I think there needs to be a better outreach to informing them of the safety, the amount of people who have been vaccinated, and these one-off cases or one bad thing happened to someone, a cousin of a cousin got a bad arm, like just like that's not 90%.
Right.
Like that happened to one person, so that's like 0.001%. And just putting it to the people so they don't think they're trying to get killed or it's something worse for them in the long run. So I think a better investment in public branding. Very few
transparency.
Very few states have done a good job at branding how important this is for themselves and for their family.
And I think there is going to be a lot of modeling going on. We've been very lucky in our families, uncles, aunts, our brothers are fully vaccinated. You know, so like I think as people of color see other people of color doing it, that this may also, you know, create more enthusiasm. Yeah. But in terms really of our work, there really is so much of our policy recommendations that have yet to be fulfilled. There is more movement now with the Families First.
The stimulus,
The second.
third.
Yeah. But again, right, we need consistent payments, especially
Extension of unemployment benefit.
extension of unemployment benefit.
Child tax credit was extended and increased, which is good.
But people are still suffering. I think that even as we see the roll out of vaccines, you know, there still is suffering happening in the United and around the world.
Yeah.
Job loss. So I think these are the things that are. Oh, Ben, sorry. Yeah.
No problem. Yeah, honestly, your comments just kind of inspired me to push my earlier comment a little more to a little bit more provocative level, which is, which is about the question of white privilege. So I live in Beacon, New York, which is a city that is undergoing a difficult but inevitable kind of white gentrification process. That's a story for another day. But I can hear, I hear people who on the streets of Beacon, as I walk around, saying things like, "Oh, I'm so done with masks. I'm ready to take off my mask," and which I identify with, right? I want to take off my mask, but there is a certain, I don't want to overplay this, but a certain, well, certainly that's coming out of white mouths. And there's a certain sense of entitlement that I think is somehow, what you both said helped me make a possible connection about the possible stigma formations that are going to happen, maybe stemming in part from a white sense of entitlement that I frankly have to examine myself on, because I feel so fed up and like ready, like, please everyone change whatever you got to do so I can take off my masks, right? But there is a race privilege in that we all need to examine.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that.
Well, Are there any other comments, questions from the participants with us this evening for our panelists? I haven't seen anything come up on my side of the Q&A or the chat, but I might have missed it.
Well, we just want to thank everyone again. This was such a delightful, a hard topic, a sad topic, but it really was great questions. Please do check out our paper. It's very accessible. You can share it with people. I think I really liked it. And we really liked it because it was so overarching. And like we kept thinking like, oh, and this, oh, and this. And really it's just these inequalities existed and they continue to exist. And now they're worse with COVID-19. And just really putting them all together and trying to think about like, this is a bigger thing than just COVID-19. This is, our system is broken. And
even the vaccine, the way you're talking about the vaccine distribution, the hesitancy is an example of our system being broken. I think, you know, the way that we can tie these two talks together. So absolutely, absolutely, Carrie.
Yeah. Wonderful presentations. Yes, and please check out Dr. Jung's work, Dr. Bueno and Dr. Bueno's work. The piece they spoke about today is published in the Minority Report. Thank you, everyone, for attending with us this evening and for supporting this wonderful lecture series. Look for a new theme next year when we pick this up again. And thank you one more time to all of our panelists this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Nice meeting everyone.
This was great.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yes, take care, everyone.